Now we're going to talk about Jewish people. Jewish people have always existed in Britain, and they've always had to deal with something called anti-Semitism, essentially racism against Jewish people because of their religion. They've been exiled from Britain, they've been forced to be moneylenders of Britain, they've been blamed for the death of babies, they've had a bad time. But the thing is, by the 1800s, Jewish people had gotten a pretty decent reputation. The first mayor of London in 1855, the first MP in 1855, and in 1874, Benjamin Disraeli from the Suez Canal was our first Jewish Prime Minister. But in the 1870s and 1880s, a new group of Jewish people were moving to Britain, Russian Jews. They were moving because the Russian people had become extremely anti-Semitic. They were committing pogroms, essentially massacres against Jewish people for things that Jewish people were not responsible for, like the killing of Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, the king. So even though this was happening, they escaped because of their war, or should we say violence, and arrived in Britain experiencing very similar things that the Irish did. They were not treated as human, they were not seen as capable of speaking English, and they were blamed for things that they were not responsible for, like hostility was brought about them because they were accused of taking jobs from other people. The thing is, these people didn't work in jobs that others wanted to work in. They worked in sweatshops, making clothes behind closed doors in hot, unbearable conditions, and they did that for decades, earning a reputation in Britain that is one that is seen as positive. T.E. Stockwell in the 1880s and 1890s managed to create a company called Tesco. Michael Marks and Tom Spencer managed to make a group called Marks and Spencer, buying and selling clothes. And those companies, or should we say those shops, turned into a chain of shops, which turned into companies, which turned into basically some of the biggest, should we say, markets for people to buy clothes and food in the UK today. Jewish people have always had an impact on Britain. It has always pretty much been a net positive, but their reputation has hurt how people see them. Now, that's not the only groups of people that we need to talk about during this section. There's actually a couple more. There's some examples of forced migration that you need to know about that the British Empire did. I'm going to very quickly skim over them. For example, in Africa and Asia, Britain encouraged, should we say, indentured servitude, which basically means people would pay, people who couldn't afford to migrate to new places, paid with servitude. So let's say there's an Indian worker that wants to move to Britain for a better life. They couldn't afford the trip over. So they say, I'd like to go into indentured servitude. I will pay for my trip to Britain with 2 years of hard labour service in Britain. That genuinely happened, and thousands of people took part in it, going around the world in the British Empire purely, should we say, because they couldn't afford it. As well as that, Australia. Australia became a part of the British Empire in around the 1700s. It was a discovery of explorer kind of thing, but you don't need to know that. Britain used it as a prison island. Britain got sick of putting, should we say, people in prison in Britain and then letting them go out into Britain again. And they came up with a genius idea to send their prisoners to Australia. And that forced and migrated loads of prisoners to Australia. In fact, most of them had a good time. Most of them actually had a better time in Australia than they were having in Britain and stopped being criminals. But that's how most of the populations of Australia to this day began. Even on top of that, we need to think about the movements of people in Britain as well. You'll know that this 1800s is the Industrial Revolution. Britain's getting more factories and people want to live in cities because that's where the money is. So we actually see migration in Britain. People are leaving farms and homesteads out in the, should we say, the random areas of Britain that are still fields, and these cities start becoming bigger. That is migration. That is things you need to know, because it also brings migrants from abroad as well. It also causes, should we say, an urban population, as you might call it, where farming is less prominent and more seasonal than, should we say, factory work. But I'm telling you loads of facts. I'm telling you tons of information. That's 3 different pages of the textbook that you need to know about, and I urge you to look them up yourself. So let's try and do these questions then. Why did Russian Jewish communities migrate to Britain? What was the history of Jewish people in Britain before this migration? How were these Russian Jewish migrants different to their British counterparts? What were the impacts of Jewish people on Britain? Why were people moving to Australia? And why was Britain experiencing migration within its own country in the 1800s? Try and use specific examples and full detailed explain to an idiot explanations in your answers, because that's what's going to help you succeed. Good luck. See you later.